Well, thank you all so much for joining me for tonight's One Night Stand presentation. This is a series of presentations that we do at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, where we focus on one work of art and one artist for one night. And tonight, we are focusing on Henry Ossawa Tanner's Return of the Holy Women from 1904. This work is featured right now in the exhibition Roichi Biv, A Rainbow of Art, which, as you might imagine, is all about color. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later, the colors that are being used here, the color palette that Tanner is employing, is one of the interesting elements about this piece. So stay tuned for that, and we'll get there. Before I get too far into this work, I want to start with just a little bit of background about Tanner. He was born in Pittsburgh. His father, Benjamin Tucker Tanner, was the minister of an African Methodist church, and his mother, Sarah Tanner, was actually formerly enslaved, and she escaped via the Underground Railroad. She conducted a neighborhood school in their home. Tanner first became interested in art when the family moved to Philadelphia. He had the chance there to see local artists and their work, to experience local exhibitions, and even to see the Great Centennial Exposition that took place in July of 1876. So that really sparked his interest in art. And although his family was kind of unsure how he would be able to make a career as an African-American artist, it was something that he stuck with and wanted to pursue. And eventually he enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he studied under Thomas Eakins there. And Eakins is one of the most important American artists of the 19th century. Eakins emphasized drawing and painting from life rather than using plaster casts of classical sculptures. And so his students would work from nude models and even dissected cadavers to understand the body and how it worked. And so I'll show you too. Eakins actually did a portrait of Henry Tanner as well. Tanner was studying under Eakins and kind of learning from him. And after his time at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts, he moved to Atlanta. There, he tried to set up a photographic portrait gallery, which didn't end up panning out. And then he accepted a brief teaching position at Clark University, which was a Methodist school for Black students. That led to him meeting supporters for his work, who then could provide him with the funds that he needed to be able to study and travel abroad. So this led to him traveling to Paris, where he became a student at the Académie Julienne, and he studied under an artist there, Jean-Joseph Benjamin Constant, who was very well known for his Orientalist work. This is a style of art in which the East is being represented in Western art. Oftentimes, the lines are kind of blurred between reality and fantasy, and these artworks could often be quite exoticizing and fetishizing, and at times quite racist. So he's kind of learning under this artist and kind of working with him at the Académie Julienne. Tanner would stay in France for most of the rest of his life. He did make a couple of trips home to the US, but he didn't stay for long. As you might imagine, during this time period, as an African-American artist, it was difficult for Tanner to be able to live the life that he wanted and receive the recognition that he deserved for his artwork, especially in the US. And that's not to say that France was without racial prejudice, because it existed there as well. But for Tanner, he found that in French art circles, his race seemed to matter a little bit less. He felt more freedom there, and like it was a more accepting environment. And beyond just his own race, he had also married a woman of Scandinavian descent. So as an interracial couple, that also made it difficult for them to, again, live that life that they wanted back home in the US. And so they stayed for most of their life in France. Tanner's early work, in his early work, he did a lot of these sort of genre scenes of African-American life. One of his most famous you're seeing on the screen is the Banjo Lesson from 1893. These are paintings that depicted rural, oftentimes African Americans, engaged in these everyday situations. They're quite humble and kind of internal scenes, interior scenes, sort of quiet. They're also quite dignified in their representation of the figures, and that was appreciated, especially by African American audiences. It differed quite a bit from the representations that white artists were doing in the time period of Black people. Those could often be very patronizing or very stereotypical. And so Tanner's approach and the way that he was handling these subjects was kind of a breath of fresh air for this audience. So that's what he was doing kind of earlier on in his career. But by the turn of the 20th century, his subject matter would shift and would come to be really dominated by these religious scenes. In 1894, he had his first work accepted at the Paris Salon, and this is the official art exhibition of the French Academy of Fine Arts. And it received some favorable attention and was kind of noted in the American press as well. And then in 1895, his rendition of Daniel in the Lion's Den was sort of highlighted and placed in a place of prominence within the salon. And it also received an honorable mention that year. And so that was a big moment for him. That was a big step for him. The rendition that you're seeing on the screen is actually not the original Daniel in the Lion's Den. You can see from the date there that this is actually a later rendition of the work. But similar generally with a few different tweaks that happened from this rendition to the original. The next year, in 1896, his picture, The Resurrection of Lazarus, was actually such a hit at the Salon that it was then subsequently purchased by the French government. So he's really building up his reputation as a painter of this religious subject matter, becoming very well known for it, and receiving this international acclaim. He's being talked about in these big circles. And so all of that is kind of providing some context for us to start thinking about Return of the Holy Women. I will also just mention before we get into talking more about this piece, there is actually another work on the back of this piece. On the verso of the painting, there is a study for another work called Two Disciples at the Tomb. So you can see he's still using a lot of these blues that we're seeing in Return of the Holy Women, but a little bit of a different subject, but still a biblical scene. But we'll focus back on Return of the Holy Women. So the subject matter that we're looking at here, again, it's a biblical story. This is the procession away from Golgotha after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so pictured are Mary Magdalene, who's at the left, Jesus's mother Mary, who's leading the procession, just kind of at the front there. The Apostle John is on the right, and then behind him is another Mary, but this Mary is wife of Cleophas, who was the Virgin Mary's sister. This was the type of scene, this sort of return after the crucifixion, that Tanner would do multiple times throughout his career. And here are a couple of additional examples of these return from the cross, return from the crucifixions that he did later on in his career. So looks a little bit different than what we're seeing with Return of the Holy Women, but something that he was thinking about and returning to multiple times. Some have argued that for African-American artists, especially those who were socially conscious, these types of biblical scenes, these scenes from the life of Jesus, could be connected for African-American artists to kind of the plight of Black people in this period. So thinking about, persecution of Jesus and kind of how that was perceived and how that could then be symbolized with the oppression of African-American people as well. So it's possible that these were additional kind of things that were rolling around in his mind as he's thinking about this subject matter. As we're looking at this piece, of course, there's a lot of kind of sorrow. The garments almost seem to drag our figures down, very kind of thoughtful and introspective. There's one figure that looks a little bit different and kind of stands out from the rest, and that's Mary Magdalene on the left. Only she seems kind of illuminated almost. She has this kind of otherworldly glow that's happening to her. And it's only her that has kind of a more peaceful expression on her face compared to the sorrow that's present with the Virgin Mary and with the Apostle John. And it could be that this was an indication of kind of a premonition almost of the subsequent resurrection of Jesus. So this could be symbolizing that event, which is soon to take place, kind of a premonition, something that she's looking forward to and able to have peace because of that connection that she has in her mind. And so that glow could be referencing that as we're looking at the picture. Tanner actually wrote about this painting in 1909. He said, "It has often seemed to me that when bowed by some sari, nature seemed more radiant than ever before. This apparent fact influenced largely the return of holy women. The moon has risen, a shepherd returns with his flock, all unconscious of the terrible tragedy of the morning or the sorrowing figures. One of them, Mary, supported by John in front of him. All is tranquility and loveliness. Only within the souls of that sorrowing mother and those loving disciples is there turmoil and sorrow." End quote. The painting is left somewhat open-ended. Its interpretation is kind of left up to the viewer, whose own spiritual life and psychology and how they perceive the scene impacts the meaning of what they're looking at. And this was something that Tanner was doing a lot during this time. After 1900, Tanner's religious scenes really kind of stressed the internal lives of his subjects and kind of a sense of personal experience of spirituality, personal revelation. That was something that he really emphasized, this idea of spiritual contemplation rather than kind of a blind acceptance. The figures that he identified with most were those that were engaged in that kind of interior, internal reflection and thinking about those things within their bodies and within their expressions as well. As we encounter the scene as the viewer, we're looking upward from a low position as the figures are walking towards us. Their eyes are downcast or concealed or turned away. And they all have these long garments, like I mentioned, in this wide range of blues and purples and a little bit of greens kind of coming in there as well. Their bodies and those garments are outlined with these kind of strong colored outlines. And the texture of their clothing is further emphasized with this heavily built up application of paint that's kind of rough, giving a lot of texture to the surface of the work. And it has almost kind of a chalky texture. It sort of flattens out the figures as we're looking at them. And so it emphasizes the lines and the shapes that are composing those figures and their garments. In the lower left of the scene, we see a brightly colored landscape that's unfolding beyond the figures. And the figures themselves take on this sense of almost kind of a monumental presence within the image. It's accentuated by the low horizon that's present there and by this kind of brightly illuminated sky. This is a moonlit scene. It is nighttime, but the moon, which is outside of the picture plane, is brightly illuminating the scene. And so it throws our figures into kind of a silhouette and gives them that sense of kind of a vertical monumentality. John there has a little bit of a circle kind of going around his head, sort of a headband. And that's meant to indicate a little bit of a sense of his own kind of divinity, a sense of his own spiritual presence, almost like a halo. So it was one of Tanner's shorthands for showing that kind of significance to the figure. During this time, Tanner's style seems to have shifted a little bit. His technique is getting a bit more loose, kind of going a little bit away from some of the realism and naturalism that he was doing previously. He's kind of building up these layers of glazes in mauve and blue tones, and creating something that is a bit more kind of loose and poetic. As he's doing that, he's not, moving away from the complex color arrangements that he was doing previously. He still has those present, but there's a little bit of a shift in kind of style that's taking place. And the picture itself, there are a lot of influences that could be contributing to what he's doing here. One of which is possibly Spanish painting. So the year before this was painted in 1903, Tanner would go to Spain, to Granada, and spend some time there. And so it's very possible that he encountered different Spanish artists and saw Spanish paintings while he was there, and that could have contributed to the style of the work and how he's representing this piece. The composition that we have in the work seems kind of similar to some of these Spanish artists who are working with a low vantage point that has a bird's eye view of a distant landscape. There are several Spanish artists who do this. The example that I'm showing you here is by El Greco. And El Greco, too, could have been an influence with the elongated figures that he did and kind of the bright color palette that he was using as well. Because in Tanner's work, too, we see these elongated figures that really draw attention to kind of the vertical space on the picture plane. And then again, that bright palette that we've mentioned a little bit so far. Additionally, he could have been influenced by his travels to the Middle East. The colors that he was using, in particular, blues, greens, purples, that are really dominating his pictures from this time, they might recall what he was seeing on these trips to the Middle East. Things like Islamic tiles and art and architecture that he was encountering. Tanner's first trip to the Middle East was in 1896, and this was financed by Rodman Wanamaker, who was a wealthy Philadelphia businessman. And he thought that Tanner could benefit from a trip like this to the Middle East. And Tanner agreed as well. He was interested in doing it because he wanted it to be able to inform his biblical religious subject matters that he was doing. He wanted to familiarize himself with the topography of the land, with the appearance of the people there, and be able to include a greater sense of kind of authenticity to his work and create a greater visual appeal in these biblical scenes. So he was really interested in going for those reasons as well. He would take studies and sketches while he was there and bring them back to his studio in Paris to work on his pictures. And of course, there's also an additional influence that could be coming. There could be this kind of Orientalist influence coming from his instructor from the Académie Julienne, right? So he could have also kind of had some of those teachings in mind as well that could have impacted the colors that he was using and how he was conceiving of this image. Other critics and art historians have also made a connection between Tanner and 20th century European symbolist art. Tanner, of course, would have been very much aware of what was going on in the art world in general and in the Parisian art world. And so it's very possible that he was encountering the symbolists and their work and thinking about them too. He did already appreciate previous artistic forms like the Impressionists and their approach to color and light and form. The symbolists, there was kind of a lack of a coherent, unified style that they were working in. But the thing that held them together, that kind of is the through line in their work, is that they were interested in highlighting an inner experience and saw that as being key to representing something universal, kind of a universal idea of a divine spirit through this kind of internal inner experience. And the symbolists were somewhat at their height during Tanner's early years in France. So it's possible that he was kind of encountering and thinking about these different ideas. And as we've talked about already, we know that Tanner was interested in that kind of internal introspection and reflection. He had kind of a personal investment in his subjects and identified with them. And he often focused on the importance of that reflection and of the reflection on the experience. In his work and in the work like Return of the Holy Women, we don't see the actual action taking place. It has already happened. The crucifixion has already come and gone. That happened. And so what we're left with and what we're seeing is rather the reactions of the figures, their own kind of internal journeys as they're processing what has occurred. And so we're seeing those responses kind of play out across the canvas, even without that physical action of the story taking place. And so we're seeing that perhaps there was this kind of shift in his art. It's possible that he was kind of moving away from that realism and naturalism of his earlier work It is important to emphasize that he wasn't, jumping into the avant-garde. He was still working within the context of these 19th century traditions and was a fairly conservative artist. But it seems that he might have been adjusting his approach to accommodate these different things that he was seeing, to accommodate this vision that he had for this biblical subject matter. We can also talk a little bit about how this work was received. So in 1904, Robert C. Ogden, who was one of Henry Ossawa Tanner's most important early patrons and an advocate of his, he wrote to Booker T. Washington, who was a family friend of Tanner's, and he expressed that he intended to continue supporting Tanner and championing his work. But he also had a little bit of words of caution that he gave to Booker T. Washington. He said, quote, "I fear that in the development of his art, difficulties have arisen that will operate against the sale of his recent work. I have seen half a dozen of his pictures, which are very mysterious in spirit, very abstruse in art, full of delicate sensitivity, and altogether too transcendental for popular appreciation," end quote. It's unclear exactly which works he's talking about with this quote, but this was coming at 1904, so around this time during this creation of this work. But it's clear, at least from this patron, that he saw kind of a shift happening and was a little bit worried about it too. Tanner himself may have been a little hesitant about showing this work. That's somewhat unclear, but there was a gap between when he finished the work and when it was exhibited at the Salon, a gap of about 2 years there. And it's kind of unclear why that would be. There wasn't any terribly exciting or controversial comments that came from critics after that exhibition. They were actually quite favorable. So one critic said, "The return of the holy women presents an effect of moonlit admirable in its atmospheric depth." And another commented, quote, "In this latter canvas, the figures are seen descending into the foreground from a hollow, whence the bluish mists are rising that give the predominant color to the whole." So it was received pretty favorably. After this work, by early 1906, he had completed 4 major pictures with religious themes. And in some, he was returning to this darker kind of brown, yellowy gold palette that is reminiscent of sort of an old Baster palette with light that seems to be influenced from Rembrandt. But he also would hold on to those blues and greens and purples, and he would vacillate between the two. So using those kind of 2 different palettes. The height of Tanner's career is thought to be between kind of 1907 to 1910, when he was completing his mature religious work. And by this point, he was looked at as a leading biblical painter of the day, even by Parisian art circles. So he had really gained this reputation and this international renown for his work. This was something that was noticed and commented on back at home. African-American leaders were communicating with him quite frequently, and they were urging him kind of again and again to come back, return to the US, to become sort of a spokesman, not only because of this international acclaim that he was receiving, but also because of those early genre scenes of Black life that he was doing. Booker T. Washington, you're seeing a portrait of Booker T. Washington by Henry Ossawa Tanner. Washington would actually ask Tanner to resume creating these paintings of African-American life because he felt it was important to show audiences, both white and Black, a more accurate and what he thought of as kind of being dignified, a representation of the race in that way. And Tanner, he didn't push back forcefully against this, but this wasn't really something that he was interested in. Tanner was never ashamed of his race or discredited his heritage or anything like that. But he did look at those attempts to sort of elevate him as an example of a Black artist and viewed it as being kind of separatist or perhaps even somewhat marginalizing. And that was something that he was, conscientiously avoiding, something that he was really trying to stay away from, and partly what had led him to go to France to have his career. And And that's not to say that he didn't continue to maintain these relationships. He did. He continued to support these African American leaders and organizations. He was a regular contributor to the NAACP after it was founded in 1910, but he just wasn't really interested in becoming kind of this example of an African American artist. For his personal accomplishments, in 1909, he was made an associate member of the National Academy of Design, along with Mary Cassatt, and he was elected to full membership in 1927. In 1923, he was named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor by the French government, and he died in Paris in 1937. So we've gone on kind of this whirlwind tour of Tanner's life and focused in pretty specifically on Return of the Holy Women. It does give us, even though we've focused in pretty specifically, it does give us a little bit more information and expose quite a lot about his approach to art making in this time and his interest in these kind of thoughtful internal subjects and his explorations of color and style. But of course, there's much, much more to talk about with Tanner, and we could go on forever. So I'm going to stop here. So thank you all so much. And are there any questions that I can do my best to answer?
Julia?
Yes.
This is Sean. Just a question for you. I know this is a very brief look at a really wonderful work in the collection, but I was wondering if there was any in your research with any connection between Tanner's interest in painting religious subject matter and his father.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, just in case, since it was so long ago, his father was a minister in the African Methodist Church. And yeah, I think that definitely contributed to his interest. He's talked about that. I believe his son has also commented on that as well, that there is this kind of lineage present that influenced that desire to create these subjects and influenced his own interest in those subjects as well. I think he very much created his own way of thinking about spirituality, kind of beyond his father. But yes, his father, I think, definitely played a role in that interest. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I just know in what little bit I have studied about it, it's never been really clear. I mean, knew his father was an AME bishop, but it was never really clear that how much that factored into his choices to do so much religious subject matter when a lot of his compatriots were not
Yeah.
touching him at all. So I wasn't sure of whether in your reading and researching for this presentation, whether you had stumbled upon something that made it clearer that
Yeah.
that
I
there was a
definitely I got that impression. Yes. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure if there was a specific quote from him or if it was from his son. But there was something that I remembered in reading through and kind of researching for this, where it seemed like he was making at least an allusion to kind of a lineage of spirituality. Um, and so I think, at least within his family, they were thinking of that. I don't know specifically for Tanner if he's ever said yes or no that that was very clearly influencing him, but I think that's a pretty good bet. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Goodbye.